swim through the graves of my friends all the time. I've lost over 100 friends to technical and cave diving accidents. You really ask yourself, is this something I should be doing? Is this fair to my family? Do I want to take these risks? But in those dark, confined spaces, I'm happy, I'm comfortable, I'm in my element. But I am scared. I'm not fearless.
That's RCGS Explorer in Residence, Jill Heinerth, from the new, award-winning documentary about her life diving into the darkness. Jill is not just one of the world's leading cave divers. She is flat out one of the greatest divers the world has ever seen, setting all kinds of records for the deepest and longest dives and making a range of important documentaries celebrating our underwater world. I am beyond thrilled to have Jill back as our guest on this 100th episode of Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast. I'm your host, David McGuffin. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. It's hard to believe we've hit 100 episodes. Jill was my very first interview back in 2019 when this all started. She appeared in our second episode, recorded in the Ondaatje Fellows Reading Room at the RCGS headquarters at 50 Sussex Drive in Ottawa.
I have cave dived beneath golf courses, a bowling alley, homes. I've been inside lava tubes submerged beneath the floor of the ocean in the Monte Corona volcano in Lanzarote. I've been in water-filled spaces beneath the Sahara Desert on the Libyan border. I've been 6,000 feet from an entrance to the surface and have swam in an underwater cave and found a skeleton laying on the floor of the cave.
The germ of the idea for Explore happened just the year before at the 2018 annual RCGS Fellows Dinner. After an evening of talking to one fascinating person after another and listening to the evening speakers made up of explorers and adventurers and researchers, I turned to my wife and said, you know, I could interview any 10 people at random in this room and have an incredible podcast series. And that was basically my pitch to RCGS CEO John Geiger and CanGeo editor-in-chief at the time, Aaron Kiley. Both were as immediately excited by the idea as I was. And what a run we've had since then. The podcast has recorded episodes in the Arctic, on James Bay, on an icebreaker along the Atlantic coast, and our guests have taken us across Canada to all three territories, from the high Arctic to the South Pole, and to many incredible, captivating places in between. Along the way, we've reached hundreds of thousands of listeners and have charted in the top 10 in our Apple Podcast category in Canada and in dozens of other nations too, helping to fulfill the CanGeo mission of making Canada better known to Canadians and the world. A mission that honestly has become all the more important in these troubling times. Thanks to all of you who've been along for the ride since that first season, and to all of you newcomers as well. We couldn't do this without you. It's an honor to be with you every 2 weeks. Doing these interviews, quite honestly, brings joy to my soul. Do you have a favorite episode? I'd love to hear about that. Tag us on social media at CanGeo with the hashtag ExplorePodcast100 to let us know, or email me, explore@canadiangeographic.ca, and we might read what you wrote us on the podcast. Keeping this going has not always been easy in this nonprofit world that we live in at Canadian Geographic. We've had bumps and hiccups, and yet we have somehow always, for the love of what we do, produced a new season. Thanks to my colleagues at Canadian Geographic who have helped make that happen. Along with John and Aaron, also Alex Pope, Rosemary Thompson, Laura Cooper, Madigan Cotterill, and former colleagues Sarah Legault, Norman Osmond, Kendra Thompson, and too many more to name out there. A big part of reaching this episode is due to our annual CanGeo Polar Plunge fundraiser, which we held last week and which fully funds this podcast. Thanks to all of you who donated and took part this year. From coast to coast to coast, you helped make it a big success and are helping Canadian Geographic and this podcast to tell Canada's story. Jill Heinerth joined us for this year's Ottawa Plunge at Meech Lake, as she has every year, and she's been a guest on Explore almost every season. Jill is not just an incredible diver, she is also a gifted storyteller. So let's get to her and episode 100 of Explore. Jill Heinerth, welcome back to the Explore podcast.
Hey, thanks so much.
we're here to talk, I think, mostly about your new documentary, Diving into the Darkness, which I've had the great joy of being able to watch. It's just incredible, and I encourage anyone out there to watch it. I will say I'm a little disappointed in myself for not catching it on a big screen. I watched it on a laptop, and I would say definitely watch it on a big screen because the visuals are amazing. But you're saying that the sound also too is really...
Yeah, I mean, the sound is an original score by a truly remarkable young composer, and in addition to that, we actually hired the sound editor for The Mandalorian to do the final mix to really make it visceral. For me, like the first time I saw it in a big screen with the whole surround sound, it just absolutely blew me away.
Wow, I'm sure, and we know that takes a lot.
It's funny, you know your own story, but but there I was, like, you know, listening and watching on the big screen the first time, and my heart is like racing, and I'm like, I know the ending.
Because I do want to talk to you about that whole process, right? Because I mean, obviously you've been telling your story for a long time. It's part of, you know, what being an explorer is.
Yeah.
You've written a best-selling book about your life and your experiences, but I'm just wondering what it's like, because this is about you, but it's not by you necessarily. Right. You handed this over to a young director.
Yeah.
And I mean, what's it like handing your story over like that?
It's scary. Of course. But I met the director, Nays Baghai, back in 2017. We were both at a diving conference in Sydney, Australia. Mm-hmm. And so this young man comes up to me after my talk and he says, "Do you have a minute?" And at this point, he was in second year of the National Film School, and he was a young diver looking to, you know, become a technical diver and increase his experience. And he had actually walked around to a couple of speakers at the conference and asked them the same question he asked me, was, "Do you have some time?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "Yes, of course I do." And we sat down and we had lunch and we struck up a friendship. But the reality was that there were a lot of people that didn't have time for him that day. Mm. And what a loss, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, when a young person asks me, I'm like, I'm going to jump in with both feet if I can and help them out. So at that point, although he was only second year in National Film School, he had already made an award-winning documentary. Right. And I looked at his work and I struck up this friendship, and I realized that this was the person to do my life story. And I had been asked by others before, but in quite a different context. And I really trusted this relationship and was excited about the fact that he was going to bring a completely fresh viewpoint from the mindset of a generation. Like, I mean, I'm twice his age, more than twice his age. And so this would be quite a different, you know, look on what I do and how I do it. So yeah, I'm so glad I trusted in the process. And
yeah, I mean, you're interviewed obviously throughout it by him, and obviously a lot of the footage is stuff you shot yourself or shot on dives that you were taking part in. But how much input did you have beyond that?
Yeah, interestingly, so, you know, right off the bat, I kind of like hand over my contacts, like, you know, here are some of my oldest friends, you know, or colleagues from expeditions. And so he reached out to them to do very comprehensive interviews. And I was not, you know, a party to any of those interviews. Even when he interviewed my husband, Robert, I was not in the room because, of course, you don't want to affect an interview.
I have to say, Robert, one of the stars of the film.
I liken it to maybe someone who's married to a police officer or a firefighter. You know, they go off to their job and it's inherently dangerous. It has some risks. But I also know that Jill does everything she can to minimize those risks. And she's very clear about communicating that to me. And that just kind of, you know, takes a little bit of the edge off for me. But yeah, I worry. I do worry.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, in a way, he's kind of like the viewpoint of the audience in a way. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I handed over all my contacts, and then I handed over all of my archives from the expedition, you know, here in a million different formats, you know, figure out how you make a movie out of this. But he was largely driven by the narrative of my book, Into the Planet. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of a guide. But once we started shooting, I became like a lot more involved in the process because we went all around the world to shoot, and we were reenacting some of my experiences that were never caught on film. But even there's a bunch of animated sequences in the film, something that would only come from a fresh young viewpoint, and that was to capture things that we didn't capture on film, because when I was a kid, we weren't running around with cameras and video cameras.
Our parents always took us out on hikes. The Bruce Trail was a big thing that we enjoyed. I loved hiking the trails, but even more, I loved climbing down into those cracks and crevices and looking around in this three-dimensional below ground space. Those were my first experiences in caving, and often those were cozy, comfortable, small places. And so I had a lot of input there too, just to help guide them and make something that was really authentic and real. And so through the shooting, we were kind of editing on the fly and figuring out what the narrative was. And believe me, we threw out like 15 versions before kind of coming to the direction that it's in now. But even after that process, Naze still had to spend 14 months completing the edit. So it's a big job.
I mean, because you've been filming everything you've done basically your whole career. So I can't imagine just the process of going through all that. We would call it tape or video now. Yeah.
Well, and the reality is, like, there's also a lot of things that I shot or that I participated in that I don't own. So, as an example, when you shoot something for National Geographic, like, this is one of the funniest anecdotes in a way. Like, back in 1997, 98, I did my first shooting for a National Geographic program, but I volunteered to shoot because the cameraman was not comfortable going to the depths that I was going to on these insane cave dives over 300 feet deep. Mm-hmm. So I did all that filming, high risk filming, and passed it off, and it ended up being something that we wanted to put in the film. So we reached out to National Geographic about getting the footage, and they wouldn't sell it to us.
No,
because they said unless it's our film, we're not going to sell the footage. And I'm like, this was shot like in 1997, 98. You'll never use this. Yeah. And we actually had to kind of go around strange, connections with different people to finally get to the point where we could buy the footage back. So
that's crazy.
So the footage that I shot for free, I ended up having to buy so it could go in the film.
Come on, National Geographic's sister organization. What's going on?
Well, I mean, that's the reality, right? Like when you're a young explorer and you don't really sort of understand the whole landscape of rights and everything, you just, you're so excited to be on a project, you just sign this piece of paper and you have absolutely no access to your own footage or the footage of you. So.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, obviously, I've read your book, and you and I have had like extensive conversations about the things you've been up to. But to actually see it all pulled together with that video is really incredibly powerful. And so, you were my very first interview for this podcast, by the way.
Yeah, I think so.
And we're coming up to episode 100. This might actually be episode 100. So
that's cool.
Yeah. So. But that first episode, we talked about your career, and the moment that really stood out to me from then, and it stands out so much in this video, is the Antarctic dive.
Yeah.
Into an iceberg that was I think it's described in the movie as the size of Connecticut.
We got to a place where we could swim underneath the iceberg, and the seafloor is on the bottom, and there's this arch of ice over my head. And it was beautiful. There was a carpet of life all over the seafloor, just voraciously feeding in the current. Meanwhile, I'm hearing creaks and cracks and thuds and retorts and all kinds of sounds that I could not only hear, but I could feel them in the sternum, in my chest. Paul and I, at one point, had returned to where we'd gone into the iceberg, and the doorway was blocked with broken ice.
So this is another interesting anniversary because it's 25 years ago, almost to this day, that I was cave diving inside
one of the caves I called Ice Island Cave number 4, the iceberg that eventually exploded on us. Yeah. It's funny. It's a story that I get contacted about all the time, even 25 years later. Like People magazine reached out this year and did a little thing, and Reader's Digest did a little, survival in real life or whatever. But it's still such an important story to me, and both in the context of what's happening in the natural world, but also in the context of politics. Like, that was the first full-length documentary that I wrote and produced. And when I was writing the script for the documentary, I was using the words climate change and sea level rise. And I was told to cut that out because that would harm the likelihood of us being able to sell the film in the United States, because they weren't ready to listen to that. And ironically, I refused. Of course, because I'm like, no, you can't
the whole point.
Cut out the world's existential threats. This is an opportunity to educate. And as a result, we did not sell it in the United States. So we sold that movie all around the world. It played in almost every national market, picked up by, Canadians and Germans and French and Indians and like everything, but not in America. It was a National Geographic story in the magazine, but they didn't take the film. So here we are 25 years later, and people are still really uncomfortable about talking about climate change or doing anything about it.
No, here we are. One thing that has changed, I think there's a general acceptance that there is something like climate change happening now.
It depends on where you live. Generally.
But generally, I think, anyway. But so, I mean, I'm sure, and again, I think documentaries like that definitely help bring that home too. But I mean, what struck me, and there's definitely some close to death moments in that section of the movie, and there's actually several of them in the movie overall, but in that one, I used to say this is a very volatile piece of ice and chunks of it are falling apart and you're in there and, there's currents blowing you backwards and all that's amazing. But what strikes me, and I've also just done an article for Cangio on Arctic diving, which I talked to a couple of people who dive out of Cambridge Bay. What strikes me is just how colorful everything is down there. Having seen the video of that dive in the Antarctic in an iceberg, just how much life there is in that.
But it's funny. I'll show pictures of my dives under the ice, and people will like say, "Oh, are you sure? Isn't that tropical? These big, colorful pink or orange anemones, or all kinds of filter feeding organisms that are on the seafloor. Yeah, it's a beautiful, colorful environment, and the contrast between that and the ice is it's pure magic."
So, I mean, you've been touring this now for almost a year, I guess, right? Is that right? When did this?
Yeah, getting on close to that. We've been on what we call the festival circuit, and that's frequently what happens if a documentary is sort of like self-funded, like paid for in advance. It's not been paid for by any sort of broadcasting entity.
Right.
Then generally you go to the festivals and get some attention for your work, and it's been really successful. I mean, right off the bat. The very first festival we were in Santa Barbara, an important international film festival, we won Best Documentary. So that was amazing. So it's been a great opportunity to sort of tour it, and now we're just trying to solidify a streaming arrangement so the world can see it, and Nays and his company will be able to hopefully recoup the incredible investment that they put into the project. But it's a very difficult time to sell, an ambitious documentary or any film project like this right now. The media landscape's incredibly difficult, and they just actually turned down a deal with probably the world's top streamer, and it was just basically over. No, we don't want anyone to re-edit this. We don't want to give up our intellectual property. Like, just because you own the film doesn't mean you own all the intellectual property. So it was, a stand for, once again, those rights of ownership. So in all likelihood, we're going to be building our own streaming platform for this.
Huh. I mean, honestly, just seems to be the route more and more for everything, to be.
Yeah. I mean, if you want a fair deal, right? It's about fairness. Now, our PR team, we have this incredible PR team in LA that have been working hard. But they've been hit hard by the fires. So
right.
So we may be a little slower on getting it out, but pretty soon we'll have a streaming option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, would putting it up on YouTube, would that be, because I mean, that generates income, and would that be something you would do?
Yeah. Well, you got to realize that there's an investment to recoup here.
Yeah, it's something more than pennies on The View, is that it?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I have a pretty reasonable size following on YouTube, but I've, never really gotten a dime for anything there. So yeah, we would get a lot of eyes, but would they recoup the investment? Probably not. So yeah. It's tricky. I mean, when I was young, there were very few media outlets. We, watched a few TV stations. And so all of the money, the investment money, was like focused on a few entities. And that includes things like National Geographic.
Right.
But there are so many media outlets now and so many ways, to even skip the big companies and, like you say, do it on your own on YouTube, that it's very hard to, stay within a reasonable budget. And I mean, we did a lot with what we had and made a lot of sacrifices to get it done, all of us. But yeah, you got to recoup that. I mean, this was 2 years of the director's life, For me, it was quite a lot of work too.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely just the whole explorer landscape, let alone the documentary landscape, I'm sure has changed a lot since you started.
Yeah. Exploration and science is really no different now either, in terms of like, where does the money come from?
Right.
It's certainly not coming from government institutions. There's no money there, so it has to come from private sources. So it's challenging.
You talk to a lot of young people. I mean, what do you tell them if they want to follow in your footsteps now?
Oh, yeah. I tell them, like, when I was a kid, we would go to school for a thing, right? Like a career, a specialization. Someone became a doctor or a lawyer, or they became a scientist in a very particular field of interest. And I said, that's still okay if that's your goal. But chances are much greater that you're going to have to be mobile. And you're going to have many jobs in your life, not one that leads to a pension and a retirement. So you're going to have to move. You're going to have to be ready to kind of jump when the opportunity arises very quickly. And you're going to have to be a multitasker. So yes, I'm an underwater explorer and my business card says explorer, but in reality, I'm a writer, I'm a keynote speaker, I'm an underwater photographer and a filmmaker, a consultant. I'm all of those things. And so the young person today may need an education in their specialty, but they also need to be a good presenter, a good grant writer, a good communicator all around. They need to create their own brand on the internet so that when somebody Googles them, they land on information that they would be proud of, using as their own resume. So, yeah, I have to be an accountant. I have to be a webmaster. I have to be a writer, an editor. Sure, I could hire other people to do that, and then I'd have no money left for exploration.
It's funny you talk about accountant, because when I got into journalism, my joke was that I was terrible at math, so I had to go into journalism. Of course, I wound up running foreign bureaus and having to balance budgets and everything else. So like,
Yeah. That's so true. That's so true. Math was like terrible for me. But yeah, I have to do my own QuickBooks and everything else.
So, I mean, when you started out, like, let's say 30 years ago, really was when you really dove into this, no pun intended. But, I mean, how much in your head was, I'm going to make documentaries, or how much were you just wanting to go and explore? Like, how much were those two worlds already combined?
No, I definitely, like, the exploration gene was there, and the desire to become an underwater explorer was there. I mean, enough that I sold my business and everything I owned and moved to the Cayman Islands, because I knew that I needed to have more time underwater to increase my skills. And that's when I started thinking, okay, well, what will I do underwater? And I thought, okay, take pictures, tell stories, make videos, and those happen by having unique experiences, exploring and creating expeditions or joining others on expeditions. So, at first it was literally shooting images, printing them, because of course, digital wasn't a thing. So film, printing them, writing stories, packaging it up in an envelope and mailing it across the ocean to an editor, hoping someone would pick up my stories. So there was no internet, there was no submitting anything digitally. I was mailing packages around the world. And that's when I thought, okay, I need to fast track this a little bit more. And I started volunteering on what I thought were some consequential expeditions. And that really was what opened the doors for me. It was meeting those people and realizing that, there would be some potential paid gigs, but I also needed to start generating my own content and owning it and distributing it myself.
Yeah. And the camera was part of that, though, almost right from the get-go, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's funny because when I moved to the islands, I literally had this sort of wad of cash set aside for, all the camera gear and everything that I truly dreamed and wanted to use. And then one of the first things that happened was very early on in my time in the Cayman Islands, my former business partners decided they wouldn't pay me back for my portion of the business. So,
oh no.
Although we had a legal agreement, they just decided that life would be a lot easier if they didn't have to pay my part back. So I was sort of left with this choice of oh crap, do I now pursue this life that I've dreamt about in the Cayman Islands, or do I pack it all in and get embroiled in legal stuff back in Canada to get my money back? And so I decided to stay. And so I went on a dive, and I thought, all right, this will give me the clarity and the comfort to know that I've made the right decision. So I go on this deep dive, and the camera system that I had imploded. So the whole thing literally imploded and flooded and was destroyed. So there I was, in the Cayman Islands with a suitcase full of scuba gear and a few clothes. And now the camera system that I thought was going to be the key to my new career had been destroyed. So there's nothing like a point of clarity for you to decide if this is really what you want to do or not. Maybe those are the things that give you the greatest clarity in life. I made the most money in my life before all of that happened, and I therefore lost it all in that moment, and I wouldn't regret any of it now. Things happen. We are the products of the good, the bad, and the ugly things that happen in life, and I guess what doesn't kill us does make us stronger.
Yeah. Speaking of that, the one scene, or the one, yes, I guess scene or act in this movie was, which I hadn't heard from you, was about getting the bends. That was how severe that was, which was almost existential for you.
When I got to the point about 20 meters deep, hours into the dive, I felt something odd happening. The first symptom was this sense of impending doom. I knew something was very wrong.
And what was that moment like?
Yeah, so it was in a place called The Pit in Mexico, a place that I had discovered with my first husband. It's actually the cave behind me, my backdrop on our little Zoom call here. But it's funny because denial is one of the symptoms of decompression illness. And when it first happens, you're kind of like, oh, what's going on? You're getting some weird sensations. For me, it was like the feeling of ants, maybe in my dry suit. Were there ants inside my undergarments, crawling over my legs? That's what it felt like, So you start to feel these odd little symptoms and you go, no, that can't be it. That can't be it. But I think pretty soon after that, there's this neurochemical cascade of your body trying to fight these invasive bubbles that are literally ripping and tearing tissue apart inside your body. And suddenly this point is reached where you're not even able to make good decisions for yourself. So that's where the denial comes in.
I think a lot of people have erroneously attributed that to embarrassment or ego, like you don't want to admit that you're hurt kind of thing. But it was more a matter of like I'm this cat that just wants to hide from its owners when it's sick, and like, just leave me alone. It was more of that. But it's terrifying because you sort of think, oh my God, like I could lose my life. If I don't lose my life, I'm probably going to lose my career. I'm probably not going to be able to do what I love to do so much. So it's terrifying in the moment when it happens. And yet that's the point where you're still underwater and you need to make good decisions about what to do next.
I mean, you talk about the denial because, I mean, in telling the story, you come out and you've clearly got the bends and you have the bends, but you spend a night there, right? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I literally was laying on a sleeping mat in the jungle, and my biceps and my thighs are all sort of with this mottled web of bruising all over them. I just hurt from my ankles to my neck, and I'm breathing on a rich mix of oxygen enriched air to try and flush out some of these bubbles. But I'm laying there thinking I'm not getting better. I have to get back in the water because one of the treatments for DCS is to repressurize the person, normally in a recompression chamber where they're safely dry. But when you're in the middle of the Mexican jungle, the only option is to go back in the water. So I had to come to that decision even though I felt so bad at the time.
So you do finally get to a hospital and you see obviously you go through the whole decompression and you see a doctor who says, he tells you should never dive again, right? I mean, what's that moment like?
Yeah, well, I went through a week of treatments and runs in the chamber. In fact, there were a couple of times when there were two other people in the chamber getting treated at the same time. But after it was done, all he said was never dive again. And that was pretty hard to take, like, because I'm still at that point, I'm not better, right? I'm the best that he can do, and now it's just time to heal, basically. But it meant that it was like weeks and weeks, like 10 weeks before all the pain and the symptoms went away, and then another 10 weeks to wait before I was ready to go back in the water. And then even when I got back in the water, it was just this very tender, slow process to decide whether I could even do this anymore or whether I was just going to get bent again, because people who get bent do tend to have more recurrences. Yeah.
This is like, 5 or 6 years really into you. And so you're really kind of just, your career is exploding. And
Yeah. I was really at a pinnacle. I'd just done these incredible dives. Like I'd been inside the iceberg. I was, held like records for, deep cave penetrations, things like that. Yeah, so I really was at the pinnacle, but maybe that was the time where I just needed a little bit of humility too.
Yes, we all need a little humility.
Yeah. And that's why, as I was saying earlier, I look back on even the hiccups in life as really great opportunities for learning. Like there's no failures. It's just discovery learning as an explorer. And, there's no issue with tripping as long as you learn a lesson from an experience and build that into your life moving forward.
So obviously you did come back and you've had many, many adventures since. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like at your age, at your stage in your career, what are you looking forward to now, and how are you doing things differently? Because you do have to pivot as you go, right?
Yeah. I'm certainly the more conservative and wise diver than I was back then. I just had my 60th birthday. I'm not stopping anytime soon.
Happy birthday.
But I do believe that every risk I take has to be worth it. Like this is not about adrenaline-seeking behavior for me. It's about data, really. It's about bringing back information, images, ideas to the greater good, to humanity. And so these days, like that's ever more important for me. And I am looking forward to spending, this last trimester of my life in Canada as much as possible and exploring things that are close to home. Like you and I grew up at a time when the world was expanding and you could go anywhere. Travel was free and available to the adventurous. And And the world is shrinking now. But we also spend our life going halfway around the world to like write about something, record something, and experience something unique. But at the same time, there were people living in those places coming here to do the same thing. And so, at this point in my life, I just want to be home and reveal the wonders of Canada and the work I'm doing in the Ottawa River and in the north. And I want to talk about climate change and water literacy, and I want to get more information out to kids and young people so that they care about Canada and our natural resources and understand some of the existential threats that we face in this shrinking world.
I'm with you. I've sort of come to the point where I like, when the time comes, where do I want to be, right? And it's like, I don't necessarily need to be halfway around the world.
That's right.
It's about family. And it's about this country, too, which I was similar to you. I was out of this country for 23 years, and I was convinced that everything interesting was happening somewhere else. And it's amazing to be back and like just find all that is amazing about Canada, and I think
we're so fortunate. We really are. And we're living in a time of reawakening patriotism for Canada. Maybe that's going to be one of the good things that comes out of this kind of tumultuous political time, is that we all reinvest in home and celebrate, everything about being Canadian, buying Canadian, experiencing Canada.
No. And in terms of the natural world, I mean, you and I are both in the Ottawa area. I mean, you're diving in the Ottawa River and into caves no one's probably ever been in, and you can drive an hour north of where I am and not see a person for days if you chose to, in bush. It's like we're so gifted with it's our superpower, honestly. I think it is. So I mean, as we're celebrating 100 episodes here on Explore, I'm curious about how your definition of the word explorer has changed over the years.
I'm so glad you asked that, because this is something I keep talking about with people recently. Like, for instance, I'm also on the expeditions committee for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, where people apply for funding once a year for a project. And so sometimes that's for a quote unquote first, a first ascent or something like that. But I think we have to be very careful about how we categorize that. Like, if we're honest, most of these exploration organizations, all around the world, really started as white settlers, white conquerors, generally men, celebrating their triumphs, and that was often to the detriment of whatever Indigenous people lived there, and without respect for their even being there or having any history in the land. And we can't obviously operate an organization with that flavor today. This is a whole part of truth and reconciliation, really, and it is bringing in the Indigenous people to say how do we address this, because obviously we want to encourage people to be curious and explore and have new experiences for themselves and new experiences with their kin, but we just have to be careful how we talk about those things, those firsts, It's also not about conquering the landscape either. So, responsible exploration, the ethics of exploration are really something that's quite interesting to talk about right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're not planting flags anymore, right? For instance.
No.
So what is that for you then? No.
I mean, for me, I've been, I suppose, fortunate to work in a realm that is clearly only enabled through technology, and therefore that exploration, is a first. Nobody swam 3 kilometers into a cave at 100 meters depth at any other time in history. So it's a little bit different for me, and yet it's still just as important for me to understand, not just literally what I'm doing, but also figuratively what I'm doing. I am swimming in the veins of Mother Earth, in the water that we all share. And so it behooves me to connect with and talk with, the people who call that region home and find out, what are your stories about the water? What are your traditions? Is the water sentient in your culture? Those things are important. Is it okay for me to swim in the water that you drink and that serves your landscape and your wildlife? And can I ask permission? Can we bless this opportunity together? So yeah, it's different for me, but I welcome every opportunity that I can to have really genuine and authentic interactions with the local Indigenous people wherever I go.
Is the water sentient to you?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question. There's no question that the water deserves the rights of any human. In fact, I believe that we're going to live in a world of conflict until we do recognize the fact that water is a precious right for every human on the planet. And it is something that deserves the protection of a sentient being.
But that's different than being sentient. For First Nations, often a mountain is sentient, and there's actual life and thought and a whole bunch of things going on in that way. Is that, do you feel that when you're in the water?
I feel like I'm swimming, like I say, in the veins of Mother Earth. So I'm literally in the body of the planet, like swimming through the lifeblood that nourishes everything, me, wildlife, everything that we rely on. And that same water, is assaulted and has a memory. and I believe at times it has a voice, like in our, disregard for the planet, ushering in these rises in temperature. We've also brought along these super weather events that we've never seen before, these atmospheric rivers that dump water in a way, like, I don't know if you've ever been in one yet, but when we were in New Zealand filming Diving Into the Darkness, the atmospheric river that we experienced there from a cyclone was something I never imagined. And I've chased floods around the world to see what happens. So yeah, it almost feels like, the water is rearing up and trying to teach us, like, wake up, listen to me. I'm showing you what's happening, and it's your time to do something about it.
That's beautiful. So if people want to see this, we're obviously waiting for a streamer, but is there a website, or how can people get information?
Sure. Divingintothedarkness.com. Just go to the website, and if you sign up on the email list, we'll make sure you get info as soon as it's streaming. There will be some screenings from time to time, and so just check Diving Into the Darkness and .com and find the details there. Yeah.
Hey, and streamers out there, let's get this up.
Yes.
Out to the public. Well, thank you so much, Jill.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always great to talk with you, David.
And thanks to all of you for listening. We made it to 100 episodes because of you and your support. And I would love to hear what your favorite episode was over the last 6 years. To let us know, tag us on social media @CanGeo using the hashtag ExplorePodcast100, or you can email me explore@canadiangeographic.ca, and we might read your letter on the air. And please be sure to rate and review us where you listen. It helps others to find these interviews. Until next time, when we'll explore again. I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June the 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
We flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.